Marina, Rudyak, it's September 20th, 2023. Welcome to BRI Dialogues.
Thank you for having me.
Well, very few people on our program come with such a knowledge and in-depth analysis of aid development, but hardly any of them has worked for BMW Foundation. So Anoush and I are very excited for this road trip in a fast car thinking with you today to get to the bottom of all things development, BRI, and the rest of it.
And I hope it's a green car as well.
It will be a green car. Marina, I want to tackle in the beginning, with your help, to set the scene, because a lot of people think that China's aid has started only in the past 10 years after, BRI, and since 2013. You have extreme research, in-depth knowledge about foreign aid and development policy of China that has been a constant in their global engagement. Can you shed some light for our audience as setting the scene about the roots of China's foreign aid and development even before BRI was conceived?
Thank you, Ali, for this very interesting and important question. You're absolutely right that China is usually described as a new or emerging donor, and still not many people are aware that China has been giving aid actually as long as the People's Republic of China exists. It was founded in October 49. China started giving aid almost immediately in 1950, first to North Korea and North Vietnam, and then very quickly it was expanded to other countries in Southeast Asia, and then to African countries from the mid-1950s on. So if we're really honest, China has been a donor longer than many of the countries we in the discourse consider as so-called traditional donors.
Marina, that is really interesting. So people tend to kind of draw a distinction between Mao and post-Mao period. And the assumption is that the Mao era was much more kind of ideological. So would you draw a very clear line between the aid strategy of China under Mao, which might have been perceived as being kind of ideological, and then the aid strategy of China post-Mao, and whether in the post-Mao period we can distinguish between the Deng Xiaoping era and then in the current Xi Jinping? What do you think?
I think there are both continuities and discontinuities. First, on the Mao era, the general perception of aid in the Mao era is that it was mainly guided by ideology. And the reason for this perception is, of course, that the scholarship that was done during the 1970s was based on very limited sources. The only thing scholars had access to back then were translated people's daily documents by the CIA back then, or how China presented itself externally in its English language communication. But now we have access to a variety of archival sources. And if we look closer, we see that there was a very clear political motive, namely China was using aid to break through the international isolation. It was not recognized internationally, it was sanctioned, but also it had a strong economic motive, namely to use aid to establish economic relations. And it is with the help of aid that China was successful in getting into the United Nations in 1971 and replacing Taiwan on the UN seat, spending a huge amount of money. Chinese scholars estimate that China was spending 2% of its GDP on aid in the early 1970s. We have the target for developed countries, which is 0.7%, which usually 5 to 7 countries reach a year, and not always. And the change that happened when Deng Xiaoping came to power in 1978 is that China started evaluating whether it could continue to spend that much on aid. You have to remember that China was among the 20 poorest countries in the world. And the conclusion to which the leadership around Deng came was that for China's international status, aid was an indispensable expenditure. So in order to maintain the status China had achieved, it would need to continue giving aid. But where a shift happened is that the Chinese leadership was looking at how to make aid also serve China's own economic interests. And very interestingly, and this is not really known, and I'm in the process now of writing a journal paper on that, and I had it as a chapter in my PhD dissertation, is that the country to whom China looked for how to emulate that and how to make aid also serve its own economic motives was India, because India, like China, had been a donor and recipient at the same time since the 1970s, and was quite successful in instrumentalizing aid for its own development cooperation to facilitate exports of low-tech technology. So this was the shift that happened from Mao to Deng. And now if we look at today, we have slightly turn back to political motives. Throughout the 80s and 90s and the first decade of the 2000s, Chinese foreign aid was mainly guided by commercial interests, and it was under the Ministry of Commerce. And now we had a shift under Xi Jinping to bring it closer to foreign affairs and to stronger use it for foreign policy purposes. But of course, it's still very, very much interlinked with economic objectives.
Marina, this is fascinating, and I am just trying to process all of these nuggets of wisdom you're sharing with us. Would you say, in that context, from this detailed picture you painted for us about the roots of China's aid and development and engagement and the motives behind it, would it be fair to say that the West were sleeping at their laurels, particularly in Latin America and Europe and Africa? And only in 2013, with the BRI gun shooting and, you know, the start gun, they started, oh my God, we're running late in these geographies, but it was their backyard for development. And if that is the case, why do you think, for instance, European Union, Europe, or United States have overlooked the importance of a similar program all these decades that China has been at it? But yes, China has had a global story, a shift in, you know, perhaps priorities. But what made them apprehensive, you think, in pursuing a similar development and aid policy, similar to BRI in these economies?
You know, this is a very interesting point. If we look at the 1970s, we see that there was tons of research on Chinese aid, mostly in Africa, on the Sino-Soviet competition. If you look at one of the earliest books of Chinese foreign aid, written, I think in 1976 by John F. Copper, it looks at China and Africa. So during the late 1970s, everybody knew that China was giving aid. And then Mao dies, Deng Xiaoping comes to power, China starts to form an opening path and opens to Western aid. And a funny thing happens. Deborah Bräutigam wrote in Dragon's Gift, we just stopped looking. Because, you know, in imaginative geographies of the West or of the global North, however you want to call it, you either a developing country or a developed country. You're either a donor or a recipient. So if you are somebody who receives aid from the global North, you can't by definition be a donor. So basically we just stopped looking, although in the mid-80s, China was the 8th largest donor to sub-Saharan Africa, giving about as much as Sweden or Canada. It was not a small donor. It only and then also you have to consider that after the end of the Cold War, aid lost its significance as a geopolitical tool to the West, because obviously, you know, end of history, everybody thought the West has won and democracies have won, and the whole debate shifted to focus on human development and global and good governance. And this is when China kind of stepped up and started linking aid with trade and investment, and suddenly, appeared in Africa, giving a huge loan to Angola without any conditions in exchange for access to resources. And Angola rejected an IMF loan, which would have come with restructuring of a lot of its governance. And this is how China first reappeared on our land maps. And then, of course, after 2013 with the BRI. So it was never gone. You can ask the question, why did the West stop looking? And this has more to do with us than with China, probably.
Like Ali, I'm fascinated by your insights, Marina. Staying on aid, as it were. So from the recipient's point of view, putting Angola case aside for a moment, from the recipient's point of view, does aid from China look different from aid from United Kingdom, for example, or from Germany, or from other OECD countries? That's the first thing that I think would be really interesting to have your insights about. And the other is, as part of China's narrative about the global South, can it easily continue to justify being the second largest economy in the world and still a developing economy that needs aid? How does that kind of matrix work in its narrative?
So I answer your first question. We talk at the moment, we talk about a lot about competing with China in the global South. Now, if you look from the perspective of global South countries, and here I'm thinking again about Africa, the West and China don't look as competitors, but as providers of different solutions. China provides hard infrastructure, roads, telecommunication networks. DAC donors, Western donors, provide soft infrastructure. It's good governance, and it's socioeconomic development, it's environment, and it's human rights. So both operate in different sectors. This is one thing. And then what we hear a lot from global South countries is that China is quicker and has less demands on what has to be met in order to engage in a project. The Chinese government usually says, we have a policy of non-interference, and to which extent this is really true is another question, but all in all, China seems to be quicker, and China combines aid with trade and investment. So it usually comes in blended packages, while DAC aid usually used to be, very separated clearly between charitable components and commercial activities. And there we also seen a little bit of movement and convergence, which has to do with the Chinese development. This is on your first question. Could you briefly remind me of the second, just in two words?
The contradiction between being the second largest economy in the world and a developing country, presenting itself to the global South in particular in that realm.
Yeah. So for the Chinese government, being a developing country is not something that is understood just in economic terms. It is an ideological term from which China also derives its legitimacy vis-a-vis the global South. We have plenty of statements by Xi Jinping himself saying China will never join the club of rich countries. China will always be a developing country. Now, the question is, what happens when China graduates by OECD standards and not eligible for aid anymore? My educated guess is that China will still continue to call itself a developing country. Another question you can ask is, however, whether it would be probably in the interest of OECD countries to continue to give aid to China. Why? China doesn't really need the money. We see a number of projects where, a project may be worth, 50 billion, and there is 1 billion of World Bank or ADB money or KfW. Now, the thing is, as long as there is at least a little of external money, the project has to run by international standards. And Chinese actors use it internally as a justification vis-a-vis other actors to upgrade their standards. So if OECD countries think that it is in their interest that China improves on standards that are considered the norm internationally, be it, you know, labor, CSR, environment, it may be in their interest to continue giving aid to China, even when China graduates nominally.
Marina, I want to draw, you said an educated guess. I think it's more than that. It's a educated insight and wisdom. So I want to take you a little bit to Global South. Putting the past 2 years and the tragedy of war aside, for the past 20, 30 years, Russia was in many ways called a gas station masquerading as a, you know, country. That was the tone in the West. Now we've come to crunch of commodities globally, etc. Now BRICS is going to BRICS Plus. And BRICS Plus is, you know, UAE, Iran, KSA, Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, and with water in North Africa. So it's a powerhouse of commodities, putting ideologies aside. And the latest thread there is that, look at South Africa. Economically, it's a basket case full of corruption. BRICS will go nowhere. Are we caught in a strategic narcissism that we may repeat the same mistake of that mindset with writing off this block again and finding ourselves in 2-3 years' time in a much greater crisis?
Well, I think we need much, much more of strategic empathy and understanding what drives countries. Why do we have 40 countries that have expressed the interest or applied to join the BRICS? It has to a large extent to do with the Ukraine war, not because countries of the global South support Russia, but because there is just such a tremendous sense of insecurity that the next best solution seems to be the bigger the better. And what BRICS or similar blocks on a lower scale, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, for example, offer is the possibility to join based on the least common denominator. You know, if you look at Western clubs, they always come with a, you know, with a long list of things you need to fulfill in order to join. And here we are at a crucial point in the sense that many countries agree with China's analysis of the state of the rules-based order. Namely that it doesn't take into account sufficiently the interests of developing countries. This doesn't mean that they agree with the solution China puts to the table, which is, to be, you know, realistic, not that much in substance. The Chinese government just published a document on, you know, on a broader outlook, which combines the Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, and Global Civilization Initiative. But this is more in the typical style of Chinese campaigns and not, you know, underfed with specific targets or ideas. It's rather, you know, let's agree on the least common denominator, and everybody can interpret it as they want. So we are at a situation where developed countries will have to either come up with an adjustment of the international rules-based order that takes into account the interests of developing countries, specifically development-related interests. And this is something China was, you know, successful in. It brought development back to the table, and now it needs to be picked up. And if this doesn't happen, then I'm afraid we may be sliding away in a world full of blocks.
That's again fascinating, Marina. I'm a bit more skeptical than Ali about the prospects of BRICS Plus, because I don't feel that they can cohere around a single item apart from a degree of you kind of democratizing the international order, which, I mean, you know, you walk in the corridors in Brussels, you hear virtually the same things, that we need to democratize our order. So I think they're probably on the same page, but whether BRICS Plus can actually become an effective bloc in the way that we see the G7 or maybe even G20, I'm skeptical. But your principal point is well taken, that you know, there are problems to do with unraveling of institutions or emergence of competing institutions. And this ramble is to take you to BRI, if I may, because I know that you have a particular interest in that as well as many other things, Marina. Ali and I were talking last week about the G20, and we briefly touched on what is now being called India, Middle East, Europe corridor. I've had an interest in the conversations that have been going on for some time between India and Japan and India and Israel and UAE and so on. But this is the first time that we begin to see this become kind of in a concrete, pardoning the pun, form. Do you see this development as part of a reaction to the BRI? Because when you look at the tenor of the arguments that are made for this new connectivity, it does have a kind of a critical undertone to the BRI. And first, and secondly, can it really compete with the scale and the complexity of China's BRI, even if it manages to proceed on the current basis?
So it seems plausible that it was a response to BRI in a similar way that we've seen it earlier with increase of India's engagement in its neighboring countries after the BRI was initiated. And in that respect, you can make the argument that the BRI was a huge success and is a huge success, even if it fails, because it made everybody else to look at infrastructure, to start taking countries seriously that were on the periphery, to start thinking about ways how to connect least developed countries to the developed countries, or to to at least more developed regions, and start engaging with the own periphery and neighboring countries in a, I would even argue, less asymmetric way. If this is what it took, maybe this is not such a bad thing, even if we have all the externalities and debt and projects go wrong. It may be the intermediate stage to something more progressive.
Marina, there's one of the blessings of working with an intellectual and collaborating with an intellectual like Anush. It's always like a judo. So so when he gives me his gi, I have to use it. So on that note, we were talking about the trajectory of BRICS and all of that, but there's a lot of excitement about India's growth. India, even if it grows at 6.5–7% for the next 5 to 10 years, from a size point of view, China at 3%, China still has a larger contribution to global GDP. Now, the other thing is that China's infrastructure at home is rather well built over the past 20 years. So this BRI is an oversupply of that capacity to developing countries. In that de-risking and decoupling with DE in the beginning, isn't there a bit of a tint of a delusional about the space and pace of catch-up by India and by the rest of the world, particularly in African continent? If you could elaborate on that.
I mean, not being an India expert, I have to, again, maybe, slightly divert to educated guesses. And Anush, please correct me if you, or disagree. Feel free to disagree with me. But I find, looking from the European perspective, I find the whole debate around India being fascinating because, I mean, just look at the facts. India's position on Russia is not that different of China, and yet kind of we approach it differently.
Yeah.
Iran just joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization while it was under Indian leadership. Now, think of all, the sanctions towards Iran. I mean, India is following an extremely smart policy of taking care of its own interests, certainly not in a less sophisticated way that China has been doing, with an advantage that it is, however, kind of a democracy. Is kind of, the other significant player that is on the table if you look at diversifying away from China. How it will play out, we will have to see. But as a development scholar, I am in favor of a multipolar world where global South countries rise, because I think in the end, we all are going to benefit from that. But if you look from purely geopolitics perspective, you may come, to different answers. From a development point of view, countries stepping up and claiming to be treated equally. Not just talking about, but really stepping into their power and claiming to want to be treated on an equal level will force developed countries to be less strategically narcissist, because there will be no other way.
Yeah. Marina, I agree with every word that you've said. Actually, I think that the BRI is a amazing strategy and is a wake-up call for everybody. But also the fact, as you rightly say, that China has put the focus very much on you need infrastructure in order to develop, and that we are going to champion it across the global South is an extraordinary revolutionary act by China. So, there is no question about that. And also, for the record, I very much agree with you about India. I think we've got to be careful what we wish for. It's a bit like setting China against the Soviet Union in the Cold War because the Chinese are one of us. And then we find that China actually had no intention of being one of us, but wanted to be its own. Thank you very much. And my reading of India is exactly the same, but with a big difference that India does not have the core structures to be another China. And frankly, it'll take 100 years, not just by Ali's economic measures, by political measures, for India to cohere as an emerging global weight. It isn't there. And I think the West is being very short-sighted in ditching China in favor of a very unknown commodity like India as it stands. But given that the West is investing so much capital in both money and political terms in India, closing its eyes to quite disturbing instabilities in India, you see it on a daily basis and so on. Sitting in Beijing, what would be your take on this? Do you say, the West, let the West their time on India, because at the end of the day, that's energy wasted? Or would you sit in Beijing and say, actually, you know what? With the strains on global chains and so on, that they may make of India what they made of us in the 1970s and 80s?
I mean, the problem now with Beijing, how I see it, is that there is a huge disconnect from the rest of the world, more specifically the Western world, and not enough understanding of how the Ukraine war, for example, has impacted Europe and the shifts that have been happening. And I mean, if you're being honest, the same type of de-risking we see the West doing now is something China already did in 2008, and from 2008 on, after it's realized due to the global financial crisis how vulnerable it is due to its dependencies on export markets. Being China, I would be, at the moment rather probably concerned about the trajectories of the West with the upcoming election in the United States. I mean, this is the biggest black swan in the equation. And do what China does at the moment, focus on the global South. because this is where the growth and the stability potentials are. But maybe, just one point to add, again, from the European perspective, I think that it is smart to de-risk and to diversify away from China, be it to India or being to other places, but for other reasons, not just because China has become more authoritarian under Xi Jinping, but because of all the frictions and instabilities we observe at the moment in the Chinese society. And with the hugely high youth unemployment in cities and the climate that has really turned within the younger generation, that doesn't see much hopes for itself. And if we learn something from Chinese history, it is that big ruptures happened when a big amount of young people didn't see hope for themselves in the future. This was in 1919 with the May 4th movement. It was in 1976, 1978, after Mao and Zhou Enlai died, and the democracy wall movement. It was also in 89 with Tiananmen. So, and now we saw how many young people and young middle class stepped on the streets during the white paper movement to express their dissatisfaction with zero COVID policy. So if this steps up, there may be, frictions within China, which will have global repercussions. So diversifying away should be done because China is becoming internally socially unstable, or it's at the high risk of that. And this is something you don't see much conversation about. And there, I think India, to a certain extent, with all its diversity and lack of structures, is probably more stable as a society because of different ways of negotiating social conflict.
Marina, very interesting. I want to ask you a question about this understanding that, there is a difference between, we're moving, as Anush rightly said, to an election year, between Democrats and Republicans, where I think, yes, of course, the tone of it may be very different with a Trump in office. But in many ways, China is looked as a peer adversary in the United States in corridors of power. So the strategy may be packaged nicely, but it's about containment. The reality, though, is that China today does more trade with the developing countries, combined more than what this does trade with the United States and Europe in terms of exports. Now, in that context, where do you think, from a development point of view, the future currency markets are going? Not as an economist, but how is this diversification in what I had the privilege, one of the things is that when you're a bald man, you consider yourself as handsome, but that is a self-professing lie to yourself. But when you write an article and you make the case for a currency, calling it R6, and 4 years later, Jeffrey Sachs comes and recites your words, you blush. But this is a genuine self-compliment. So I'm happy to share that article with you. I've been talking about it as far as 4 years ago as a, real, rupee, renminbi, rand, real, and ruble. Do you see in that space of development a new yearning for decompressing the weaponization of US dollar? And will that play as well in the very ambitions of China as well moving forward?
Well, we've seen it as one of the major topics on the agenda of the last BRICS meeting, right? And one of the underlying objectives for many to express their desire to join the bloc in whatever way is the whole debate about the de-dollarization and looking for alternative currencies. We are seeing part of Chinese trade not being handled in US dollar. So, very obviously for many countries, it is in their interest to have alternatives. And, of course, we can expect with the US elections, to stay on a similar China course, but what happens if you do have a US government that suddenly decides to declare that Taiwan is an independent country? what does it mean? I mean, to what extent will it force China to react in a specific way? And what will this mean for the global South? And how do you insure yourself against all the possible, risks and negative repercussions that may come out of that for a global South country which is not involved in the issue? You're muted, Ali.
I think you've stunned him, Marina, which is a wonderful strategy for getting me back in. So thank you very much for that. Unless you want to come in, Ali. Marina, I loved your responses to Ali's query, but also to mine about the West having a balance, and your response about India is brilliant. I agree entirely. We don't seem to focus enough on the using China's own language, contradictions within the Chinese system, and are apparent, increasingly apparent, as you rightly say, and you know better than anyone else, given that you follow everything in China in Mandarin as well. So you're in a very privileged position to have your views on that. But so sitting in Europe, we have concerns about what happens in US elections next year. We don't know what will happen in the war in Ukraine. We are unsure about China's continuing prosperity, for want of a better term, or unhindered prosperity. We like India, but we know that it's limping, for want of a better term. And there is, of course, Brexit. Sitting where you are, within the European Union, where would you put your precious euros for the next 2 or 3 years to mitigate these kind of train crashes coming your way, possibly, and also having this strategic vision about how to compensate for them, where to look? Where are your chips going to be, do you think? I know it's a very unfair question, but given what I know about your work and your experience, I think we couldn't ask this from anyone else but you.
Well, to begin with, I am a long-term strategic thinker. So I think, calculating in terms of what's going to happening in the next 2-3 years is what brought us where we are. So I think we need a way, more long-term strategic thinking, and we shouldn't be guided by fear to the extent that I think we are now. We talk a lot about what is the risk of this action, which is the risk of, that action. We don't talk enough about what are the costs of certain actions or inactions. And my favorite example is actually sanction, which clearly did not achieve desirable outcomes, but maybe even have backfired. Looking at Iran is more integrated with other countries than it was a few years ago. China seems to have their own 7mm nano chip, right? With the Huawei phone. So, if you would ask me as Europe, I would look to our neighboring continent, which we have neglected for a very long time, where Judy Moore, who is, the former Liberian Minister of Public Works, now with a think tank in Washington, who says, before China came along with the BRI, there was no creativity whatsoever in Europe of what to do with Africa. And nobody is close to Africa as Europe is. So my recommendation would be, again, to really start taking the problems of our global South neighbors and also farther away global South countries serious as our shared problems, not as their problems, but as our problems. Because in case of Africa, It obviously is. We talk climate change, we talk migration. It is our problem. And come up with policies that are long-term forward thinking and are designed to really, not to defend what we have, but to build up something new, which is long-lasting and resilient.
Marina, I want to just make a short comment because it resonates a lot with me, what you said. It's very wise. It's not just a strategic thinking, long-term strategic thinking, but it's current pragmatic necessity to think that way. And it reminds me of Juan Guaido, whom we brought for Venezuela and we called as the El Presidente and all of that. And then we dumped him as well, which resulted to 1 million refugees from Latin America across Rio Grande. And again, it brings me to North Africa and the tragedy in Libya last week, which we saw with our own eyes. And at the very last year of Gaddafi, we can't stand him, of course, but he had a contract with a Turkish engineering company to come and run an audit on those 2 dams. And because of regime change, he's gone. And my question for us as development topic is that in a case like this, in a rundown country, that the West was at the center of regime change, if China comes tomorrow and sweeps it and adds it to that pearl necklace next to Ethiopia and Egypt, we have neglected and we have miscalculated in our geopolitical games. And Africa is going to be the highest growth in population of youth. And I think it's a lost continent for us because if we want to go in, we have to latch on to BRI. Do you think these short-term strategies of, geopolitical quarterly results, we look at them quarterly results, China is in succession planning and wealth generation transfer in some ways when it comes to geopolitics. Do you think that these have a blowback effect on even if we want to get engaged in North Africa or African continent?
Yeah. So first, I think, we would be better off learning from the past lessons. And we don't even have to go to Africa. Let's just go to Central and Eastern Europe. Why did China build roads and railways there? Because all the EU members didn't. There was a development space, the Western Europe left, and China stepped in. So this is something, first, again, we need to learn that development is a serious issue and countries need development. And if you don't do it, somebody else will. Now, for Africa, for the moment, it seems that the EU is not going to start building roads and bridges on the massive scale. We don't have the manpower for that. We would have the funding, but, as former business people, you may know that it's always a question of distribution and allocation of resources. But at the same time, African countries are like anybody, very pragmatic and understanding what can China deliver and what can Western Europe or Europe as such deliver. And what we are seeing increasingly, by the way, it's not on the agenda of many people, is that we do have Chinese companies doing construction projects in Africa and engaging German business consultants to make sure that projects run according to international standards, because they realize, bad projects, bad reputation, protests by local population, protests by the workers, costs money. Let's engage the Europeans. And this is something we should be looking, from a development perspective at more pragmatically, and maybe even think about trilateral cooperation projects. I know that there is a debate in Washington saying that it's probably not in our interest if China starts doing better projects because it's going to strengthen the authoritarian system. Now, from a development point of view, this is a standpoint that really doesn't take into account the agency of recipients and partner countries. And also from a development point of view, there is no competition in development.
Yeah, absolutely so, Marina. That is so insightful. I want to relate a story to you, and then maybe seek your reaction to it. So Israel and China have had very close relations going back decades, and it includes intelligence, military, security partnership for a long time that have kept on the radar because China was not an adversary at that time. But since China has become adversary in Washington, they've become very sensitive to what Israel does with China. And of course, Chinese state and private companies have been pouring over infrastructure projects in Israel. And Hawaii came and went, but then the port of Haifa came into view, which is strategically important, as you know, in the Mediterranean, because American Sixth Fleet visits it very often. And so Chinese companies wanted to bid for it. The White House intervened and said, no, you mustn't do this and so on. So the Israelis said, okay, we make an open bid. And guess what? Not a single American company bid for it. And the Israelis said, well, what do you want us to do? We've got a project, we give it to the Chinese. So do you think that, in parts of Africa, the same dichotomy could emerge, that we could press these countries to open up their development agendas to us, and then they do so in response, and then our companies say, you know what, the profit margins are too low, it's too risky, it's too remote, and so on, and then we leave it wide open for countries like China to go and take advantage and say, look, we are doing it because they wouldn't do it. So it then becomes a true political statement rather than just a developmental statement.
Well, then you have to ask the question, why is it obviously not worth the cost to build that port or to build that road? And then in the next step, maybe, look at alternative channels to build alliances or build partnerships, and or tender out, provide co-financing, run open tenders. And if Chinese companies win, but then again build to international standard, well, this is your typical commercial business process. Or, again, if as a government, if you decide that China should not be building it, then we are with subsidies. Then we have to subsidize construction companies to go out and build. And this is a political decision in every democracy, whether the taxpayer supports that.
Very interesting, Marina. What Anush so nicely brought to our attention was repeated in Piraeus port in Greece as well, which was exactly the same case. We haven't learned, as you rightly said. And we normally bring our sessions with a question for our esteemed guests like you, with the hope that we learn something from them and for our audience. So if there was one single piece of advice, Marina, that you would dispense to the cinephobes today, what would that be? And one single piece of advice to the cinephiles, what would that be?
I think my advice to them would be the same. And that is, start taking Chinese language serious as the language in which this part of the world in which people in this part of the world make sense of the world, right. And communicate it. Because we rely, most of the Sinophiles and Sinophobes in the West rely on translated knowledge, on secondhand knowledge. And only a fraction of what is published in China is translated. Official translations by the Chinese government are very often propaganda documents. And this leads to images of China that are projections of what is going on in people's heads, and not what is, the diversity of debates and what logics, landscapes, what drives the people. So in that, and I understand that it's difficult because, coming from Europe, Chinese is really a foreign language. Coming from Germany, Italian, French, English are just one dialect of the same Indo-Germanic family. Chinese is really a foreign language, but we need to invest in language capacity and in strategic translation to be really able to understand what people are thinking in order to meet them and be able to co-create a world that can last in the future, because there is no other way around it. In the end, we're not going to survive on conflict.
Marina, your words are burning into my mind. Absolutely wonderful, and that message goes to the heart of infantile policy making, certainly in Britain, but also United States, where languages are seen as secondary, non-essential. And I see that sadly as a byproduct of globalization, where the assumption was that the world functions in English. And you rightly say that to hear China, we need to understand China. And it's not just China. There is so much of the world. After the Cold War, we assumed that Russian was a defunct language. Look where we are now. After 9/11, we assumed that Arabic and Dari were defunct languages. Look where we got to at that point. And you're right, you're putting down very strong markers about the need to understand the multipolarity of the world in which we live now. And also the need to really hear our partners, the other, through their narrative and voices. And you're right, China is not a monolith. There is a multitude of sounds in China. And you rightly said we only hear the bits that we like to read and hear, and only the ones which are translated. So I hope that message that you've put out there goes far and wide in Western circles. And ironically, of course, it's the reverse of what's happening in China. They set up BRI and they set up universities that teach every language in the BRI partnerships to make sure that the Chinese understand the partners that they're dealing with. That foresight is what is missing here. And your insights are putting that very much on the agenda for our Western policymakers, analysts, and leaders to learn about the complexity and diversity of the world in which we all find ourselves. And I can't thank you enough for everything that you've said today, the insights that you presented up with us, but also with the sage and wisdom that every comment has been rounded up with something really practical for people to begin to think about. So Marina, Ali and I are really grateful for you to taking the time and the effort and the energy to give us your valuable insights and analysis. So thank you very much.
I want to just add to what Anu said very briefly. 500,000 students from Global South are on scholarships in Chinese universities. All of them will go back to their capitals and their motherlands. And you have, as a development expert, 500,000 pair of ears to look up to you and to learn from you on how to do this development in a structured, sustainable, scalable, and reputable way for years to come. So thank you very much, Marina.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It was a pleasure to talk to you.